What's up, ladies and gentlemen of the internet? What's going on? It is Triathlon Tech Tuesday. And on this channel, I feel like we're constantly bombarding you guys with information about aerodynamics. We've talked a lot about rolling resistance with tires and things like that. We've talked about which tires are fast, which bike lubricants are fast. We've talked about all these different things, but we haven't actually really talked about, I think, kind of the key ingredient here, which is power and actually applying force to the pedals to actually propel you forward, right? So without power, you are absolutely going nowhere. You can have the most aerodynamic setup in the world, but if you don't apply power to the pedals, you're not going to go anywhere on the bike. So what I thought I'd do is kind of like a two-part series where we just go through the very, very basics, like intro to power meters, intro to power, what is it, what does it mean, where is it measured, things like that. And then I probably will circle back in a couple weeks and just go with a little bit more depth about basically training based on power, some of the terminology that you might see, like normalized power, variability indexes, things like that, where we can actually look at kind of like a little more in-depth topics of if you guys are training with power, and maybe even how best to race based on power. Okay, so power meters live on your bike. They're a component of your bike. They're a piece of technology that live on your bike. They can live in different locations. You can actually have a power meter that's actually based on the hub, which as your chain puts pressure on the hub of your rear wheel, typically, there would be a strain gauge in the hub that would measure how much force you're putting into the bike itself. Power Tap usually makes these. They're fantastic. Another very common location for a power meter is inside the crank spindle itself. And then again, as you're putting force on the pedal and turning the crank arm, the strain gauge is measuring how much power you're putting into the crank itself. More recently, there have been other places for power meters. There's the new kind of common one is within the pedals themselves, which is what's currently on this bike. For example, these are the Garmin Vector pedals. And then again, the same thing with that. There's a strain gauge within the pedal itself, and as you push down on the pedal, is measuring how much power you're putting through the pedal itself. There are some alternative ways to measure power. I think basically you can look at, I've seen some things where it's kind of looking at like how much wind is coming into the bike and stuff like that. And those are more estimates of power. Again, what they'll do is they'll say like, you know, we can correlate this number with this other number. It's not really a true measure of power, of how much wattage you're putting into a particular location. But let me back up just a little bit, because what I thought would be slightly important for this introduction to power is to explain like, yeah, these power meters are kind of placed at different locations within the bike, but you know, what are they? What do they measure? And what they measure is they measure in watts, like the wattage, the amount of power that you're actually putting into the bike itself. But they're strain gauges, and strain gauges have been around for a long time. Strain gauges are basically, the concept is this: a given metal with an applied force to it will bend a certain amount, at a particular temperature. So for example, if you have a steel rod, it's set at a certain temperature. We know that steel rods at a certain width will bend a certain amount given a certain amount of pressure. So when we know the amount of pressure, we know the amount of watts applied to that particular object. So this is exactly what is happening within your particular power meter. Whether it's in the hub, the crank arm, or the pedals, it really is strain gauges measuring how much force you're putting into the pedal. So that force could be pushing down on the pedal or pulling up on the pedal. That's still wattage that's going into the bike and making it go faster. So They started using power meters probably 20 years ago or so. It's really just kind of like taken off. Almost everyone is using power-based racing at that elite level, and then kind of triathlon races as well as like all of their training, all of their workouts and things like that. Heart rate training has been around for even longer, probably 40, 50 years. It was really kind of becoming mainstream in the late 80s as far as like training based on heart rates. And a lot of the concepts kind of translate over to power, right? So they established heart rate training zones. And then same thing, I think the power meter groups of people that were kind of studying this stuff just borrowed from heart rate training, and they established power zones, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5 power, like how much power you can put out. So you might be in like that threshold power zone, which means you can hold a certain amount of power for probably a good amount of time. Whereas if you're sprinting, that's a different zone, and you want to spend certain amounts of training time in those sprint zones, and other times lower down in your zones, like zone 3 powers, where you're just doing some of that threshold work. Similar to heart rate training, people will do complete workouts, complete training programs, all based on power and based on different power zones. One number that I should probably throw out is FTP. And I'll go into more detail about this a little bit more in the second part series, where we talk a little bit more about all these different numbers and what you should use these for. But I want to briefly touch on FTP because it's probably the number that you hear people talking about all the time. FTP it stands for functional threshold power. And that's the theoretical number that you would be able to hold, how much wattage output that you would be able to hold for an hour. To get this number, most people will do, 20-minute tests. There's a ramp test that you can use. There's a number of different tests that you can use to try to estimate exactly what you could hold if you had to for 1 hour. Like your life depended on it, this is what you had to do for an hour. That is your FTP, your functional threshold power. So that FTP number is kind of what all of us talk about when we're talking about our power, and what zones we're gonna be in is typically based on that FTP, so percentage of FTP. The other kind of metric that I should probably touch on is watts per kilo. If you are lighter weight and you're able to put out a lot of power, you will be able to go faster. So in particular on hilly courses, I'm training for Ironman Canada, which is a very hilly course, and watts per kilo will matter quite a bit. So that's a term that you might also hear quite frequently. With that, I want to save some of this for that part 2 series. I don't want to dive too much in depth of power meters, but I want you guys to have a little bit of an understanding of what power meters are when we chat about them all the time, like watts per kilo or a new power meter on the market or whatever it is. I'm hoping that you guys have just a little bit of information so that you guys can kind of like grab that stuff, say, yes, I understand what Matt's talking about. It's not for me, or it is for me. Yes, I think I should grab something like this, and have a fuller understanding of what power meters are. So hopefully that helped. If it did, please consider subscribing to this video. I'm gonna put out some more stuff, I promise. And if you liked the video, hit the like button. There's also a notification bell somewhere up here. And what that'll do is it will allow you to receive notifications when I finally come up with that part 2 of power meters and kind of a little bit more in depth about power meters and how you can use them in your triathlon races. So with that, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you guys on the next video.